Hello, everyone, and welcome to the first non-live, all-in-person episode of the podcast featuring Milo, Riley, and Alice.
Hi, how's it going? I joined you in the bunker down in London. I got an Avanti West Coast train. I've suffered greatly, and now I'm here. I'm very, very excited to be here.
That's right.
Yeah, we are. We're in the Enver Hoxha commemorative podcasting
That's
bunker.
right. Yes.
And with us, of course, today is returning champion, in fact. I believe his third appearance, but his first in quite a while. It is the Commonwealth think tank's Matt Lawrence. Matt, how's it going?
Yeah, it's a pleasure to be here. I was actually told it was the Fritzl basement. So, in some ways, maybe that's an upgrade to have an Albanian.
It depends on the day, really. Yeah, it depends on what kind of chilling crimes you're looking to be involved in.
Indeed.
Look. A lot of stuff has been going on, right? And we are here to, as almost an expression of discipline, to
self-discipline.
Self-discipline is rather than just indulging all day in the continued slow-rolled collapse of the Tory party that really hasn't been arrested ever since Boris Johnson had that suitcase of wine. We are actually going to talk about that for a little while, issue one correction from Corrections Department. And
they don't get a lot of airtime on the show, but we've got like 12 people working up there on the third floor.
But we are then going to talk with Matt a little bit about some of what Labour intends to do now that they basically are measuring up Downing Street for new, sensible, low cost but effective curtains.
That's right. Yeah, they're going to do a much cheaper job on Downing Street than Carrie Johnson did. And Keir Starmer's going to go down to MFI.
Yeah.
I welcome the curtains, but I call upon them to go further and have like maybe a Roman blind.
Yeah, that would be nice.
A bit rich for the taxpayer, though, I think.
Venetian blind?
I think ultimately, what's going to be very
getting
important.
closer and closer to home.
People
Sort of
don't like being
Droitwich
reminded of Italy. So I won't be having Venetian blinds.
Well, after what we experienced with Liz Truss doing British things for British class interests in the history of multiple British projects, some of which are directly anti-European. The Economist looking directly at it and being, what is this, Italy?
Oh, I saw a BBC commentator call it Caracas on Thames.
Yeah. So,
very cheap house prices there.
The thing about Caracas is more stable politics than London at the moment, and for a while.
Yeah. The instability in Venezuela is more in other ways. It's
That's true.
Not really
yeah. Look, we're not getting any Silvercorp mercenary. Silvercorp comes on holiday here.
Yeah.
They're not washing up on the shore, sort of being, although maybe, at this point.
Got a little job for them.
Some guys from Florida just...
I've been offered a job in London. I'm going to take a little trip to the Thames, if you know what I mean.
Look, before we get into all that, corrections. Meta has not, in fact, cracked the technology for legs.
We were fooled.
We were
bamboozled. We naively believed that just because they announced that they had developed the technology for legs, that they had in fact done that, and they hadn't. We who do a podcast about how technology companies lie to you all the time, believed a technology company, mea culpa, maxima culpa.
And we believe them simply because if you've got the technology for the upper body, presumably you don't really need different technology for legs. That's just more of the same. That's just like, is the upper body materially different from the legs in terms of how the computer sees it? I don't think so.
No, the arms, the legs of the upper body in many ways.
Exactly, yeah.
So unfortunately, while we did not mean to endorse the incorrect assumption that Meta has in fact cracked the technology for legs for the upwards of a dozen people who are using Horizon Worlds, we want to issue a formal apology to the listeners that we do not in fact endorse that. We recognize that the idea still, unfortunately, does not have legs.
I was waiting for someone to use that.
Yeah,
and I was the first. So no, look, I'd like to sort of set us up with a little clip that will, I think, set the scene a little bit, especially for our American listeners.
It has been a night of astonishing scenes at Westminster, with reports of jostling, manhandling, bullying and shouting outside the parliamentary lobbies in a supposed vote of confidence in the government. The Deputy Chief Whip was reported to have left the scene saying, "I'm absolutely effing furious. I just don't effing care anymore," before he resigned, along with the Chief Whip. But we've just been told they have now officially unresigned. The Home Secretary has, however, definitely gone. In short, it is total, absolute, abject chaos.
We have now had a chaotic vote that over fracking that has led to the now downfall of Liz Truss's government.
A fracking fracas.
In Caracal terms.
Yeah, that's right.
She has now offered her resignation, having shown all of Britain exactly where the Conservative Party tips over into being a victim of its own success.
Yes, sort of like hitting the bottom of the barrel, having thus begun to dig, and we've now scraped through onto the concrete floor below.
Correct. And so she has resigned after, as you said yesterday, a number of Tory grandees and whips. But Americans might not know this. The way you vote in the House of Commons,
like everything else in Britain, it's primarily bullying based.
it's you get up and you walk into a lobby that is yes or no.
Yes.
And so you vote quite literally with your feet.
Yes, but the people who are, assigned by your party to make sure that you walk into the yes or no room correctly are called whips, and they're called that because they're nice. Normally.
Correct.
And unfortunately, there's been a huge deviation from this standard of behavior in that, they're suplexing people through windows or things of this nature.
And so there were reports that, Jacob Rees-Mogg, Therese Coffey, other whips, and so on were literally grabbing recalcitrant Tories who didn't want to come out in favor of fracking, which was considered a confidence motion in the government, which would have brought them down, and literally pushing and shoving them into the right doorway.
For the purposes of defending Liz Truss as well. It's like really the sort of Götterdämmerung for so little stakes as this.
I know. Liz Truss was like, I wish someone was picking me up and shoving me through that door.
Well, exactly.
And the only thing, right, is I guess the question I have to ask, and this is to everyone. Maybe I'll turn to Matt first, because you've been a long time British politics watcher.
Alas.
Who could have guessed that kind of at the end of this chapter of the Tory ideology would be so slapstick? Other than everyone at this table, I think we all probably guessed it. But what do we make of that? Right, that this project that was started by Thatcher, sort of coming to a head in some of the biggest oafs in the country, kind of shoving some of the biggest nerds in the country through a door.
Well, I think like Toryism as a sort of political project always had an element of like high fast, almost high camp to it, combined with like sort of a brutal sort of boot combination, going right back to Thatcher. But I think in some ways, we can look at Truss's end and what's going to come really as sort of a much deeper story of essentially the stagnation of British capitalism. So if you look over sort of the long term, what we're seeing is sort of the waning dynamism of British capitalism. And what the Conservative government have tried to do over the last 12 years or so is tried sort of series of different manoeuvres. First, austerity. Second, Brexit. Third, Trussonomics, which in its own logic was an attempt to jolt into life a very stagnant economy, a stagnant, unequal economy. So there was some logic to it. And I think in some ways, the sort of bind we're going to get now is the sort of cure that will be offered up in response to the disaster of sort of Truss's budget and all sort of the manoeuvres and the loss of credibility and the sort of pressure from financial markets. The cure to that, to buy stability, will worsen the underlying condition of stagnation. So, if Jeremy Hunt proceeds with, essentially austerity 2.0, brings in sort of a set of measures that kind of stabilizes financial markets, those same measures will double down on the economic conditions that are generating stagnant pay, inequality, and sort of the sort of malaise we're seeing across the country.
And I think the fact that it was the end of this particular chapter of the ideology, I think it's right and proper that it was so slapstick, because fundamentally what all of these projects have done is they've tried to animate a body that has been dead since the 1990s by applying electricity directly into its brain.
Yeah, going to the sort of Victorian cemetery with a shovel and a defibrillator.
Yeah, effectively, yes. And I think that's quite the horror image, I think, is quite useful. I mean, if you look at Marx, he uses a lot of Gothic and horror images throughout his writing.
Because he was cool.
Yeah, because he was cool and goth. But I think what we have had ever since we realized that we could sort of stay on the carousel of paper growth, of inflating asset values, of largely having an economy where we just manage stuff that happens elsewhere. That's a lot of what the British capitalism, a lot of the actual thing that happens in British capitalism is just sort of managerial and services activities that are directed mostly elsewhere or at the central bank via the state, basically.
Emails jobs.
Yeah, email jobs. And that, that when that decision was taken is kind of when the patient went terminal, and it was decided that the model of British capitalism that we had, that the Tories were there to defend, they were there to defend an ownership class against various generations of rabble, whether that's peasant rebels or whether that is trade unionists or whatever.
Podcasters, whoever.
People eating yogurt and tofu and stuff.
Yeah. From broadcasts to podcasts.
Yeah. But that's what they were there to defend that elite from. But then that elite became so detached from the country itself that they continued to try to defend the interests of people who really weren't there anymore. And so, if anything, just ended up in so doing sort of killed what was left, and then have spent the last 20 years attempting to just run electric currents through a dead body. So, no wonder fucking Therese Coffey is picking up a recalcitrant, a fucking Johnny Mercer or whoever, and physically throwing him through a door.
Oh, I choose to imagine it's any of the sort of like tougher in their own imagination story MPs. Your Mark Field, your Steve Baker, anything like that. Yeah.
Like taking Mark Francois and rolling him like a bowling ball.
I like the idea of Johnny Mercer having to give back his green beret because he got a manhandled by
Therese Coffey has actually been awarded it ceremonially now.
Yeah.
But I think really, they were each of these projects that were totally unconnected to any kind. They were totally unconnected to the world around them, right? These projects that were a product of a totally internal conversation, right? They all kept working in terms of they got to execute them, but they never had the result that they wanted, and so they kept executing increasingly insane programs.
I think that's true, but there's also like an internal logic to it all. So if you go, the rentier turn, the turn of the British economy to a world in which ownership, as you say, is fundamental. That's how people sort of sweat assets to generate income. It's sort of fundamental to how Britain's political economy works. I guess there's a question why did sort of that neoliberal turn happen, in the sort of late 70s and then obviously into Thatcherism? It wasn't just random. It was a response to a prior sort of thing, which was the stagnation and crisis of British capitalism and indeed global capitalism. And then that started this logic, which you've kind of described, of privatizing Commonwealth, sort of selling off assets, but also in the process creating a political coalition based around asset ownership rather than work. And that there is a logic to that has sustained. And I wouldn't be surprised if we see looking forwards, what will happen is there'll be an attempt to be like the sensibles, quote unquote, will be back in charge, which will combine austerity with an attempt to try and ease the pressure on mortgage owners as the basic Tory bargain. So it's kind of on the one hand, absolutely mad that they've tried to sort of juice assets like this for ages, but there is a sort of internal logic, and we can kind of then see from that where it's going to sort of proceed. And also I think we've got to kind of locate this turn to a rentier society, not as a sort of spasm of this is just madness, but actually a sort of rationalized response to sort of slow down in global capitalism that precedes Truss's madness by a number of decades, to put it mildly. And therefore that actually then opens up, I think, a conversation about the solutions, which are just more than, we just need to get the sensibles back in charge.
Well, if the sensibles get back in charge, they've got some ideas. But largely, I think their ideas seem, and correct me if I'm wrong to my friends, their ideas largely seem to be we're going to take up the mantle of Toryism, and we're going to do it without the nonsense.
Yeah, all of the sort of commas and semicolons are going to be in the right places, and I'm going to get a very good grade for my economy.
We're going to get some nonsense.
I think but indicative of that is, I don't know if you saw that tweet or know who he is, but sort of Rupert Harrison, who used to be George Osborne's advisor, and he got into a tete-a-tete on Twitter.
Well, now he's one of the Council of Wise Men that's running the country.
And prior to that announcement, he'd got into sort of argument with a series of sort of commentators on Twitter, kind of defending austerity, being like, this really is what like actually made Britain much more resilient in the face of the crisis, which obviously, as lots of people were pointing out in the replies, is just like a complete misreading of the actual consequences of austerity. But I think the very fact that he was then appointed that later that day, or a few days later, I think is indicative of the general direction of travel and sort of intellectual sort of inheritance that what is going to come will follow, and the sort of like brief truss interregnum will be, sort of thrown in a pond, the ripples will disappear, and we'll go back to sort of almost a sort of continuity period. But I think with much more instability, because the world has changed. That regime of cheapness, of cheap money, of cheap energy, of cheap food, that has been abruptly come to an end. And I think that's going to put intense pressure on an already sort of fragile model of capitalism. It's
what we have, right, is we have the appointment of our Mario Draghi figure in terms of Jeremy Hunt, right? The man, the current prime minister, the sensible indeed, who is, as you say, appointed a bunch of the George Osborne finance people to his actual council of wise men. And I think that the thing that we're talking about here as well, right, is it is too important, right, to maintain this kind of stability, but to maintain this kind of stability for bond traders, basically, to allow politics to come too close to these decisions again. That's the whole point of the sensibles. That's the whole point of the idea of political sensibility, that the places where politics must not tread.
Exactly, and that's the thing. Like, so the sensibles bind is this, like, to sort of use the phrase by this economist Minsky, is like stability is destabilizing. So their political project is to reassure and stabilize financial markets by a series of interventions, austerity, and a series of other things that will themselves lead to the destabilization of the social fabric of the UK. And so I think, we also we've got stability, but it's a false stability that's coming, because it will involve intense social pain and sort of amplification of all the sort of trends that are frankly going only in one direction. But, it will come with a packaging that will scream, this is stability, this is what's needed, this is just tough, sober government.
Oh, the idea of just being like, well, as you can see, this austerity that we've brought in, it's very, very good for a lot of the numbers. You can see like the numbers here, the interest rates, stuff like that. That's all. House prices are going up. That's all good. Unfortunately, if you look at this other graph, the number of heads being clattered off is alarmingly spiking, and I think we need to do something about that.
Well, the thing is, Bartertown, that enjoyed a very, very stable economy in one sense. But the social services really did leave something to be desired.
It had a flourishing entertainment sector.
That's also true, yes.
And you know what? It enabled someone in a non-traditional relationship to take on a leadership role.
Absolutely.
Yeah. You don't know what Master and Blaster were up to.
Yeah.
No, but
so much the same as Liz Truss.
What we have now, right, in the middle of all of this, is we of course have a Tory leadership election where,
or do we, is the question, because
I can't remember the last one. When was that?
Oh, God, ages ago.
What I was just thinking actually at the start of the episode was, did the period where they were choosing a new Tory leader last longer than trusted? Because it felt longer.
Yes, it did.
Yeah, I think it must have been.
It was longer than 6 weeks.
Yeah. Amazing.
Yeah.
Great.
And it's in what I think, because look, the best way to understand most events in liberal democratic politics at the moment is largely that the funniest outcome will happen.
Yes. So Boris back.
So we're finally look, it's Britain's chance to apologize to Boris.
That's right.
Is Boris a two-term non-consecutive prime minister, but almost consecutive?
Don't call it a comeback. He's been here for years.
What I think is extraordinarily funny is that noted thriller novelist and sometimes TV host Robert Peston has suggested...
Well, Roberto Pesto now.
We haven't read his book yet. That says there is a risk that the Russians may hack the Tory leadership election between Sunak, Boris, and Penny Mordaunt so far, if the election is conducted online, which they intend to do so it can be done quickly. Which to me implies the question, and this sort of implies a bigger question, what outcome is the sabotage outcome?
Yeah, who are the Russians going for? Who's Putin's guy?
The only way I can think to sabotage this would be no clear winner, somehow. If you could get sort of like no overall control sort of results.
Putting the leftists in charge could not necessarily be the worst outcome. So just put the leftists in charge, no outcome. And also in a very sort of sober, boring thing. But I do think it's quite interesting that the Tories are yet again choosing a prime minister with a voting system, electronic voting, which they're making illegal for trade unions to ballot on. And it does seem quite striking that that's their definition of You can choose a prime minister, but you can't choose to go on strike to
it's
protect wages
not
and
the
conditions.
important stuff. You know?
No, I'm excited to see Zelensky make a speech where he's like, "Lettuce is great friend to Ukraine, shoulder to shoulder, leaf to leaf."
But also, it's like the other question that I think we have, right, is what is left for the Tories to do, given the ideas that they have?
Oh, very
There's a bit of copper wiring left in the walls, you know.
Is there, though? I feel like we're down to sort of drywall.
There's a few stainless steel forks they could sell off and maybe get something for those.
Sort of melting down the taps, that sort of thing.
Yeah.
So much as to say they've kind of, if you think about it, right, they have found the level to which they can cut taxes that will, like, they found the amount that will start, like, hurting the people that they depend on for votes.
Yeah, there is a lower limit somewhere. We found it.
They found the lower limit that they can cut taxes to in any near term. They have basically also identified
that's it. The next project is finding the lower limit of what sort of social services, what kind of social life can exist in Britain, right?
Yeah.
We haven't found that yet. I think when we do, the response may be somewhat more spicy than we saw with the markets even.
Yeah.
But I think that's the next project, is just like, how much pain will people bear?
Yeah. I think
in the case of Liz, quite a lot.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
I mean, no, that's a woman that's definitely enjoyed the last 6 weeks.
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
More than anyone, I think.
Yeah. She's safe now. She's back in the vac cube.
Right, but I think there is this this sense that why I sort of talk about the not the death of Toryism, certainly not the death of conservatism, but the death of this ideology of it. This form of the ideology having run out of the stuff that it does, because not because it was defeated at any point, but because it was a victim of its own success. It did so much of it. It smoked the whole pack, basically. And now it's sort of hacking up along.
Like, it's inside a dumpster that it's locked itself in. It has hotboxed that dumpster, and now it's beginning to get quite uncomfortable.
Yeah. And so, there is, I think, that real question of what will they do? What do they have? What we know, what one thing they have done is effectively, if you're caught at a protest, they can just put an ankle tag on you.
Oh,
now.
sure. That was Suella Braverman's thing before she resigned, was even more draconian sort of like repression. That's going to be fun. That's going to make a reoccurrence. The other thing is, when they're cutting, it seems likely that whatever sort of like next prime minister there is will ring fence defense spending. So, because we have to continue to send, various things to our great friend Zelensky. So everything else is going to be that much deeper. Health, presumably. What little NHS there remains.
Yeah, what little NHS there remains.
Education.
Plans to reform social care. But the worry here, right, is that there's already private healthcare coming in and growing. There's already like academies coming in and growing. So we know what that looks like, and there's nothing left for the Tories to do in order to just hasten the death of these public institutions, other than just sort of wait. So
a caretaker government in that sense, do you think? Yeah,
they're a caretaker government watching the final sort of the bits of dust settle on what they have done for the last 12, arguably 40 years.
And big Sam Allardyce brought in for the last 8 weeks of the season, shaking his head on the touchline.
And there's a sense among the right of the Tory party, or the people of Nigel Farage and GB News types, that there's this refrain that you can see among them that, the globalist won. Everyone is now a big Remainer. We've got Mario Draghi coming in the form of
like sort of recurring and now total humiliation of my ideals is, just proves the total victory of my enemies and their power.
And I mean, we say like these guys, your Dan Wootens, whatever. Dan Hooten.
Dan Hooten,
Dan Holleran.
Dan Hooten and Holleran has
Rootin' Tootin' Wooten.
Rootin' Tootin' Wooten has essentially gotten everything he asked for, right? All of these Remain globalist people or whatever, like they're doing sort of what they wanted. Like there's nowhere left to go on Brexit. You can't Brexit more at this point.
Oh, I mean, you say that now. Sort of deploying our new foreign secretary to the channel with a big hacksaw trying to like cut off the channel tunnel.
Yeah, just exploding Northern Ireland to resolve that issue,
Yeah, well, if I was going to guess, and this is a complete hostage fortune, I'd imagine kind of the opposite in the sense like there might be rhetorical plays on Europe, but I think essentially the next Conservative government or next prime minister will pursue essentially austerity. They'll look to the Bank of England to provide them more flexibility than currently, it sounds like they'll be able to, but there's always more flexibility in a way than normal politics says there is. So there'll be a mix of austerity. I think there will be a sort of retightening of relationship with Europe, albeit sort of a loose, still very loose and still with like antagonistic rhetoric. There'll be tax rises. There'll be a big pitch on trying to protect homeowners somehow, and therefore some sort of like Bailey-Hunt compact. And I think they're still on kind of high, and then definitely the sort of, a cranking up of authoritarianism. But yeah, so I kind of think it will feel quite like the 2010s, albeit with much higher interest rates, with, wages have not grown for 20 years, real term wages, benefits, sort of on the floor, etc. So I think it'll feel quite a lot like the 2010s in a way, I think, with an added dose. So I think, I think we'll see. But I don't think that'll be enough because it feels like there's a sense like, the tide's gone out on them. But I do think there will be a big concerted push to be like, hold on a second, we can stabilize this. And I don't think they can. The cat's out of the bag. But I think, I think they're not going to I think they'll, if it's a sort of, restoration of sort of, Osborne era people, I think there will be a sort of real push to be like, no, come on, financial markets, we are ultimately your friends, and come on, type attitude.
Dare we say the magic words, first as tragedy, then as farce?
Well, I mean, that's the other thing, right, is that there's this, of these guys, the Rootin' Tootin' Wootins, they've said essentially, right, this is the globalist coup, they've taken away the democracy, they took our Boris, they took our Liz, and now they get Jeremy Hunt, the guy that, like, basically the British deep state, for whatever reason, has decided is their guy.
Sure.
Because he's so boring. They need a boring guy.
Yeah, exactly.
But we got him. And, I think they do have this correct sense that this is profoundly undemocratic, that governing for and to bond markets, right? Rather than trying to manage the international on behalf of people living in the country, managing people in the country on behalf of the international is profoundly undemocratic and extremely weird. But all of the like right-wing like GB News people, all they really care about is the fact that this means that people like them aren't going to be on the news anymore.
Well, one thing that I heard was that the Corbyn team sort of wargamed this possibility of the bond markets doing as they did in response to Corbyn being elected Prime Minister. And I don't know how it worked out in their scenario. I don't want to compare the two in the sense that like pouring water and pouring fuel on a fire are, both pouring liquids on it, right? But I think mostly what I get out of this is how unprepared the right of the Tory party were to get everything that they wanted.
Yeah, I think that's gonna be right. I think like it's almost like that metaphor, like the dog caught up with a car unexpectedly, and like they're like, whoa. I think so. There's two things. I think there's like there is an interesting counterfactual of like if they were sort of smarter and they've got their sort of timings better. So they'd have gone with, we're going to cut public spending first because we had too much overspending during COVID, and then they were like, okay, the OBR says that's just about okay, and then they cut taxes, and they just did it in a slightly different order. It's not like the bond market is suddenly like egalitarian warriors who are like, no, this is unacceptable because it's inequality. It's because they're like, this is like, you are obviously just incompetent, like the moron premium, as the sort of FT was saying. So I think
the woke bond trader, we had one of those on the show.
Exactly, that's right.
And then the wargaming, I think that, that's a very nice metaphor of like the water and the fire. And it is like, I think, even if you had loads of water as a sort of left program, the bond markets are always going to look at you differently. And there's only so much you can do. But I mean, I think there are, nonetheless, I think a sort of fatalism that says, well, therefore bond markets will just completely inhibit our room for maneuver, that we lack autonomy, is definitely the wrong thing to take from this. And that's a slight like risk of like, we told you so. And then the final thing would be on the sort of crime betrayal. I mean, isn't that like the essence of like far right politics, like the politics of betrayal of like some essence? That's it. And that's just like inevitable on whether it's Brexit, whether it's tax cuts, whether it's whatever it is, that is like the sort of beating heart of their politics.
Well, the left-wing government will just have to deal with the woke bond traders.
I just think
calling
that
all the bond traders in, like, listen up, Yuxel.
there was no way that,
Larry,
a sub like Liz Truss was going to like bring the bond markets to heel, and that's just all there is to it.
Yeah,
subprime.
Well, also, right, it's the thing to remember here. I think this is sort of moving into more Labour territory, right? Because they're acting as though they are a government in waiting once again. they are.
Can I say how much I hate that Starmer's strategy of waiting it out has been vindicated 100%?
I mean, it was gonna work. You just had to wait.
Yeah, just do all of your sort of like factional knifing leftwards and just remain calm,
And
assured.
All it cost was experiencing the actual crisis as opposed to avoiding it.
all it cost was like materially harming the country.
Last thing, actually, before we move on to labor as well, is like, I can't see it not. Look, I don't try to make predictions very often, but there are who else is going to stand that could get enough votes from MPs other than the three of Boris, Mordaunt, and Sunak.
I think the Mordaunt years would be very difficult for me personally. So I would hope that.
But the members, they love our Boris.
They do.
They will never. That means that Boris is going to return at the country's moment of greatest need.
Well, I understand Sir Graham Brady is trying to like rat fuck him, but we were talking about this earlier, and the thing is, if Boris comes back, essentially what he will have done is gotten a month off work for the Queen dying, and then just being back, you know? It's like a leave of absence. Took a very short sabbatical to not finish the book, and just uninterrupted.
And I mean, if I was to wonder, right, like that, at this point, right, all of the sort of stuffed shirts of the Conservative Party now associated with what's going on now and this sort of full frontal assault on their exact constituency, right? They would probably end up being relatively trounced by Keir Starmer, but Boris is entertaining. You get the fun guy back.
First is fast, second is fast, third is fast. It continues.
Yeah,
There's
a lot of fast. Yeah. He's consistent. He's Mr. Consistency.
That's true.
You get like Uncle Fun back, and then all of a sudden, I don't know, maybe all of his lockdown stuff, that's really boring. That's so old. We've had Trassonomics since then.
That then does point to Mordaunt, who does combine that like high camp that I was talking about earlier with like a sort of.
But I think ultimately, right, is that there's a lot of opinions now on the defeat of Trussonomics and what that means. And I think that the Labour Party appears to be, as it currently stands, gleefully taking on the idea, which is that Trussonomics is bad, and it was bad because it was hammered by bond traders. Right? That seems to be the idea that's taking root.
And consequently, anything structural, anything that angers bond traders will be, as destabilizing as destructive.
As opposed to the correct idea, which is, Trussonomics was stupid, and that's why it was funny that they were surprised when they got hammered by bond traders, who they were trying to accommodate rather than confront.
It was a revolutionary change in the wrong direction, which is a very funny thing for a country to have done, I think.
I mean, never count Britain out when it's time to do a revolutionary change in the wrong direction.
Yeah.
But I think this goes back, in fact, to something Starmer said today. What Starmer said today, I'm actually just going to find the exact quote. He says, "When we talk about economic stability, I want to be frank. The damage the Tories have done means things are going to be really tough now and during my Labour government. We cannot take any risks with public finances and first have to restore economic stability." And I think if you just switched out the party names, George Osborne could be saying that in 2010. That is exactly what they said.
Yeah, I think that's the sort of big political battle now, to sort of contest that framing and say, as you were saying just now, it's not sort of borrowing to invest or borrowing to spend, it's the content of what you're borrowing to do was the issue. That there's a moron premium, that this is like obviously a farcical way to try and restore sort of dynamism to a sort of stagnant economy. And so like if Labour do retreat into the sort of framing there could easily be read as a retreat into sound money, quote unquote, we're going to retrench our spending. On the other hand, they have publicly committed so far since sort of, I think it was on Johnny Reynolds on BBC Breakfast. For the American listeners, this might seem very strange, but on the BBC Breakfast, they did commit to uprating benefits, uprating pensions, committing to the 28 billion. So I think it is an open sort of tension as to which way it will go, and I think it's part of the role of think tanks, commentators, etc., to try and really stress actually it was the content, not the nature of borrowing to invest. Clearly, borrowing now is in a different environment to where it was, where borrowing rates were on the floor. But I still think, like, clearly the political battle now is to make sure there's still an expansive role for public investment, for public coordination of economic direction. I think that the dovetail of that is to kind of really insist on, you know, there's a lot of wealth around that we could tax, which would then be like almost like the left response to, like, how do you stabilize the markets? It's not by cuts at all. That's going to be completely resisted. It's by, you know, an agenda to tax the rich, and that opens up fiscal space for the type of things we need in this country.
Yeah, because if we want to talk about where a lot of the we can think about this thing in two ways, right? We can think about, well, where is the money? A lot of the money is in Frank's house, in Bill's house.
Well, in Frank's empty house, and Frank is an oligarch. You know?
Exactly.
It's in Frank's mattress.
Yes.
Yeah. Exactly.
Yeah. Frank's actually unfortunately fallen out of his window while padlocked into a suitcase in an unfortunate suicide attempt.
He was too stressed.
We need to talk more about mental guilt. If only Prince Gary had gotten to him.
but you know, that, like, ultimately, right? You know, it's in two areas. It's in what is owned by individuals in terms of, you know, money often squirreled away, in terms of also, like, inflated asset price, because, like, the asset prices are still very inflated, right? They didn't just deflate. They're not back to normal.
You're telling me that it's not like sort of divine writ that a house in London should cost 28 trillion quid.
Weirdly, well, actually, depending on which version of the Bible.
Sorry, that's now 29 trillion.
But at the same time, a lot of it is in what we do, a lot of it is in what we don't own, what we've chosen to not own. You know, not what we've chosen to take, but what we've chosen to give away. For example, I believe you said the Malaysian government owns more of our offshore wind capacity than we do.
Yeah, so the UK's offshore wind capacity, roughly half of it is publicly owned, but I think the UK government owns 0.03%, which is less than the Malaysian government, less than the city of Munich, about 2,000 times less than the Danish government, etc., etc. So yeah, we have
fantastic,
fantastic, really sort of long-term thinking there.
You know, and
yeah. Just the eternal thing in British politics, which is that the British government must never own anything, even if it's like a big money printer. They're like, no, it wouldn't be.
In fairness,
it wouldn't be
do
right.
Kind of own the Bank of England.
That is true. That is the one money printer, the literal money printer, where it makes things bad when you turn it on.
Yeah.
But as opposed to the money printer, which doesn't do anything bad when you turn it on, a wind farm, they're like, no, it wouldn't be right for us to own that. It wouldn't be proper. It wouldn't be cricket.
Yeah.
A private company has to own it, and then we need to rent it back from them.
We have to run government like a business, which means it can never make good investments, and it has to prevent all of its, like, subsidiaries from ever making good investments too.
Well, I mean, the thing is, like, labor, as we're talking about, as we're going to get into more, right? There's now much talk on the sort of about the future of Britain as, okay, well, this was a catastrophic failure. This was now an idea whose time has come. What lessons are to be learned from it? And I think really there are two lessons, which is, number one, don't do Thatcherism unless there's an oil boom and a lot of public resources to distribute. And number two is try not to be in charge of a country when the Fed is tightening rather than easing.
But generally speaking, you have to let sort of socialists and social democrats build up the capacity of your state for 50, 60 years before you can go slashing and burning through it. Otherwise, you're just sort of slashing and burning through stubble.
Yeah, that's my bone I'm cutting.
Yeah, and you can do that as long as, like, you can do that. You can run on fumes, but the fumes have to be coming from the big money printer in America.
Yes,
and as long if neither of those things are the case, you should try to avoid being in government. Basically.
Well, that's the Tory backbenchers who are like, a spell in opposition would do us good, sort of thing.
I mean, I realistically, I don't think they conceive of it that way, but I think they do. There is a kind of understanding that they're out of options because they're out of stuff. There's no more new North Sea oil, and the credit's expensive. So what the fuck are they going to do?
Keir Starmer is standing, 5 feet wide in the doorframe going, Mum said it's my turn on the Xbox.
Yeah. Yeah, but my turn on the Xbox, but, like, I don't know.
Welcome the Xbox.
But, you're stuck on a save file with, one health and a wooden sword. You're about to go up against, one of the various Dark Souls bosses. So it's not exactly an easy situation that they're inheriting. And their first instinct, as we've seen Starmer say, is to largely make the same mistakes that led his led his future predecessors, that's a bit of odd tense there, to this exact position.
Crisis on Infinite Starmers.
The predecessors that will have been by the time he...
Is the predecessors that will have been, right?
His
is to
post-decessors.
repeat all of their mistakes. That seems to be the idea that is not in the party in general, not in the British left in general, certainly, but in the bit of the Labour Party that seems to control most of what it says and does.
Well, Riley, those who don't repeat history are doomed to learn it. So think about that. A very wise man said that.
Right? So thinking more about public ownership, which is kind of, I think, and this is something that I sort of gleaned from some of your writing, if I can sort of draw a conclusion, is the difference between what the Tories have been doing and what Labour sort of wants to do, and the way to actually, say, build state capacity to make yourself not just a better place to live, but also, dare I say it, a more credible place for capital to want to do business, is fundamentally to invest in and own things. Basically, that ownership kind of is the difference.
Yeah, I mean, I think ownership and sort of property relations kind of are the fundamental dynamic that structure social relations under almost any economy, whether it's sort of frontier capitalism, socialism, whatever society is. It's kind of like the sort of nodal force of how we organize society, economic and social relations. And I think the thing about public ownership, which is an attractive thing, is that it is flexible. So you can run it. You could run a sort of publicly owned wind farm as a for-profit entity, or you could run it as something that is run at cost and actually sort of helps reduce bills, distribute surplus towards local communities or the public as a whole. And the whole point is that by comparison, this sort of for-profit corporation that's privately owned and sort of owned and has shareholders, it's got one thing only in its sort of DNA, which is to sort of maximize the wealth of shareholders, the returns to shareholders. And so it's very rigid and inflexible. And so like when we look at the sort of series of crises and sort of time horizons of those crises, sort of the sort of climate crisis as a whole, housing, really any challenge we're looking at as a society, that rigidity versus of private for-profit modes of delivery and provision versus the sort of flexibility that democratic forms of public ownership at multiple scales, from local authorities to the UK to the Scottish or Welsh government to city authorities, there is a lot more flexibility in terms of like what matters, what are we trying to do, how are we trying to provide for people. So I think there's a huge amount there. And then, I mean, to step back, public ownership should be located in a wide...
You don't want to be making that mistake in your role. Private, I mean public.
Scrap that.
The two, privatization and the nationalization buttons, very close together.
Exactly. That sort of sweating face meme. But yeah, I mean, I think to step back, I do think public ownership is definitely a fundamental part of it, but I think it's going to be part of a sort of multiple steps, which is why I think, yes, it's, a tight spot right now, but actually there are ways out of this that can, I don't know if you saw some of the, that ITV report last night on the news of sort of, it was interviewing 3 people and it's opened with the sort of, so woman in retirement who basically like can't afford to, basically like heat like food half the time, and then another family. It's just obscene levels of poverty that we can really abolish if we have a different political strategy. And that would involve much higher taxation of wealthy asset holders, to your point, and indeed just like higher income earners, and that would give us some of the flexibility to increase spending to abolish some of these like obscene and completely ultimately unnecessary forms of deprivation we're seeing in the UK. But then to do that, you also need to reform the state, transform and democratize the state, which is where sort of public ownership as a role for anchoring and directing the economy comes in, directing it towards social and environmental and sort of pro us goals rather than pro accumulation goals. And then sort of you layer that in with sort of democratization of work through the expansion of collective bargaining. You sort of roll out sort of much more expansive and generous welfare system that kind of alleviates rather than sort of is punitive towards people's lives. So I think like there's always much more there's no denying that sort of the global environment means there's less room for maneuver potentially than there was maybe when borrowing rates were so low, but there is always much more room for maneuver, particularly when you coordinate between central banks and treasuries. There's always much more room for maneuver, and some of the sort of obscene insecurities and injustices and indignities that people have to endure in this country that are politically driven, we actually do have the tools, even though things might be tough right now. We absolutely have the tools to challenge and ultimately abolish those.
We could get rid of Mr. Blobby.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, that's quite hard. That is, that's a cultural,
the bond market's going absolutely haywire. Guys in like stripy jackets on a trading floor, just head in hand as Blobby is being executed.
Well, that's why they love him, sort of similar plumage.
Yeah.
I think Noel Edmond works at BlackRock. That's it. So he'd be like, "Fuck this, I'm out."
I think my question, right, is what we have seen over the last, I think since Thatcherism, we have seen attempts to reconceive of British capitalism as something else, right? Thatcherism came about because one form of British capitalism had died. We had a new one. A lot of currents
was killed off.
Yeah, it was killed off, in fact. And
like Mr. Blobby.
Yeah, like Mr. Wolf.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Capitalism softly uttering Blobby.
But what we, as you said earlier, right, is we had these attempts to kind of rejuvenate British capitalism, to reinvent it, of which, Corbynism was one, right? It was to say, look, British capitalism is broken. Here are the things that will fix it, and we're going to do that by creating broad-based social legitimacy for an economic system broadly called British capitalism. That's what that kind of was. There were others, as you say. There was austerity. There was Brexit. These ideas that we can redo British capitalism. And once again, right, it seems as though what Starmer is going to be forced into, right, what you say is very nice. I think it would be great if it could happen, and I think it can happen. But I think that there are powerful people in the Labour Party who are resistant to that idea of transforming British capitalism in that way. And I think my question again is, will they simply be forced by circumstances to, let's say, transform British capitalism in the way you're talking about, or will they just continue with their narrow orthodoxy and fail again?
Well, I do want to say I think it's important to give them the option, right? I think that's the value of having the sort of the serious case, if you like, the like responsible prudential case for like a sort of a left transformation of the economy, even if they choose to reject it. So it's there, right? Yeah. It's on the table.
And I don't want, and again, this is not me trying to be a cynic or a doomer, right? It's my question rather is, if we're basically at a situation where, because there has been infinite essentially managing upwards for global financial markets, more or less, and purely cultural managing downwards, just trying to change the entertainment that's on the TV in the form of
executing
Brexit,
Mr. Blobby.
Yeah, exactly. Right. But that much of the managing downwards has been a managing of what we give to you is culture. We will vanquish your enemies. We will humiliate the tofu eating, your shitty nephew that you hate, and all this. We will humiliate those people.
The podcasters.
Yeah. From broadcast to podcast.
From broadcast to podcast.
And meanwhile,
I don't like how that's become a sort of like homily that we're doing, like a call and response thing, like from broadcast to podcast, and also with you.
Yeah, exactly. And from podcast to broadcast.
But right, that in managing sort of Britain on behalf of, say, bond traders and stuff, on behalf of global credit markets, on behalf of capital, but very international.
It's not a very
capital.
rousing speech, that is it?
No, right
for the bond traders, for global capital.
Yeah. Well, that's why it has to sub it in with, "Don't you hate your nephew?"
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I do hate my nephew. Get rid of him.
But right, is that's sort of no longer possible, largely because we've made ourselves an unattractive environment for the bond traders, basically. And so my question to you is really sort of, this is all good. But will they be able to manage the British economy for the people who live here, essentially? Like, is that something that is in the realm of possibility?
So I think there's a couple of the thing I just sketched is, I think it's fair to say that's not quite where Labour is right now. That's definitely true. I think, secondly, there are some things which I think, broadly would do exactly what you're saying. So, whether you look at, them attempting to sort of reset employment relations, so sort of a much greater role for collective bargaining, some kind of like nuts and bolts things that aren't particularly sexy, but that would make a material difference to people's lives. The big question is really, yes, okay, that's great, and to be welcomed, but do they address the sort of like the deep currents? Are they sort of like going along on the surface and riding the wave, or are they addressing the deep currents that are sort of in the ocean, the oceanic depths, that are kind of moving British capitalism around its productivity crisis, around its investment crisis, around that combination of stagnation and inequality.
These sort of like fucked up ocean floor looking guys, like a fish with a light hanging in front of its face.
So
It's
we
got like
welcome-
London housing market written on it.
So we welcome these things, but we call upon them to go further.
Yeah.
We do.
Was that-
Into the
and
Mariana
this is what I'm
Trench.
driving at,
And
right?
the question
Yeah.
is like, that fish with the light bulb,
Yeah.
is it just gonna be like in the dark, the profit in the sort of, oceanic depths, or will there be actually saying, okay, hold on, you're right, there's a structural crisis that needs a sort of response that is equal to them. And that requires institutional response, it requires fiscal and monetary response, but it also requires, I guess the sort of social and collective movements to try and push that forwards. I think on the plus side, currently it looks like there might well just be one of those sort of like, sort of affairs in the tides of men style elections where it's just like people have just had enough, and there will just be, and so there might be a sort of very significant like, non-Tory majority in the House of Commons, which will give you the flexibility to really redesign the sort of institutional fabric of the UK's capitalism. That could also though lead to caution. It could say, well, we're going to win. Don't do anything more. That's it. And like, obviously...
Keir Starmer, don't say anything.
Yeah.
Anything you say could be... Keir Starmer acting like a guy who's been arrested with a kilo of cocaine.
This is
It's
where
like,
the prosecutorial
no
sort of
comment.
like background comes in to help him. Because he'll know this, It's Shut the Fuck Up Friday.
I don't have to answer that.
and so this is sort of what
You're
I'm
going to
driving
vote for me anyway. No comment.
As you say, right, is that the tendency, I think, of the sensibles, of the idea of the current sort of Labour administration as a kind of probably where things are going to go, unless, of course, our Boris charms the pants off the entire country. Right, is
I think this fucked up looking fish from the bottom of the ocean, it's an ugly chap, but it could be a great British fish. You could have it with chips, and I think we can bring that fish back. We can go down there and we can bring this fish and we can get it together with Mr. Blobby and we can have a house party.
right, should this happen, right, is that I think their inclination will be to move things around on the surface. And I think you can actually see some of that with the plans that have been released so far for Great British Energy, which is, again, much, much, much better than the alternative of not having it, right?
It's shuffled over a low bar, a sort of limbo bar that's like a tripping hazard.
Yeah.
Where I mean, I think that or something like Great British Energy doesn't exist to sort of confront the private sector in the energy market. It doesn't exist to change the relationship between sort of private equity companies or foreign governments, indeed, that own the generation capacity, or that the fact that our grid for some reason is privately owned, or the relationship between retailers and energy consumers. What it does is it exists to take a public stake in and crucially de-risk and crowd in private capital for investments that many of them don't want to undertake. That's the kind of thing, right, that can cost quite a bit of money and can make an improvement, but it's not the kind of institutional transformation. It is a tinker. It's a surface current.
So for readers, for listeners, maybe you make transcripts, who knows? But for listeners who don't know what Great British Energy is, it's sort of at Labour's conference, they announced this idea of creating a publicly owned energy company that would generate energy. And sort of their aim would be to be the size of EDF, which is France's nationally owned energy company, which produces the vast majority. I think it produces over 100% of France's electricity needs and sort of exports it. So I think it is a very good test case of exactly the type of, fork in the road that we are facing in terms of a potential Labour administration. So I think absolutely, if it's low bar, if it sort of pursues a sort of like unambitious agenda, it could end up doing largely what you're saying. It could be a sort of a small slice of a broadly privately owned market in which the resources of the commons, the wind, the waves, sort of solar radiation, which really is inherently social, becomes privatized, becomes a resource of either foreign governments, private equity, multinationals, and you have sort of, GBE operating a few wind farms here or there, but not doing much. I think in its defense, my understanding is it's not just kind of like investing in small projects and de-risking. It's de-risking frontier technologies, which, is, you could argue, potentially useful, but it's also investing and actually owning and operating its own sort of, asset base. So it's not just being like, oh, I'm owning a 5% stake. It will own wind farms, and own solar farms, etc. But it could obviously be like, it produces 3% of British energy. And, will that reduce bills? Will that mean the wealth of the commons returns to the commons? Will it sort of, accelerate climate justice? Will it onshore good unionized green jobs? at scale, a question mark. On the other hand, they have committed it to be the size of EDF. Now you can say, well, that's nonsense, who cares? But on the other hand, they have publicly committed to being the size of EDF. And so in some ways, the opening, and I'm not saying it's guaranteed, but the opening is say, okay, great. Well, EDF is a vertically integrated company with its own supply arm, which sort of speaks to your point there. It's a company that at scale required significant investment, but very significant benefits. We can just see that in the energy crisis. French bills have gone up by 4%, British bills by 65%. That not just because EDF is nationalised.
Better than the fucking French.
Well, exactly.
4%, we pissed all over that.
Exactly. That's our bond yield difference now as well, basically.
Exactly.
Yeah. So so it's not the only thing, but that is a big part of it, the fact that this is a nationalised, public champion. And so, there is an opening there to say, okay, fine. Right now, it could be the much smaller scale ambition, but we'll take you at your word, and we're going to push to try and say, right, okay, well, this is the investment. This is the sort of capital expenditure you need to invest to build 50 gigawatts over the next 10 years.
So sort of the door has been opened a crack, and now is the time to insert a sort of left-wing boot into it.
We need a left-wing Therese coffee to throw us through the door.
Genuinely, yes.
Yeah.
So I think both that. So I think ultimately, its anchorage is in the idea of the resources of the commons should be, developed for the public and the sort of commons, not privatized, and that's the sort of fundamental upstream argument. And then downstream is reduces bills, it gives you the flexibility to sort of prioritize different goals, it allows you to plan rather than just be led by the market. But I think it's anchored in left ideas of democratic planning, decommodification, and such like. This is if it's at its ambitious scale. But in some ways, I think the beauty of it potentially is we should try and mobilize behind it, not just the left, because if you look at polls, the idea of these principles are actually very, very popular in terms of energy in particular. The public are very behind the idea of energy not being something which basically is crucifying households, but as just been breaking the households budget of millions of people in this country. It has been a source of extraordinary profit. Generators are expected to make, what was the Treasury thing, sort of 170 billion pounds of excess profits in the next 2 years. I think there's a sort of
for working so hard.
And so I think there's a deep sense that could build actually quite a big political block around demands that then can be put on to say well, you've got this institution, go a lot further, go a lot faster. I'm not saying that will work, but I do think there's majorities, political coalitions always constructed. They're not sort of just arrive from nowhere. And so I think this is an opening to say, great, okay, here's an institutional form, here's a potential benefit, here's the trajectory. If you're serious, you need to push on, and if not, why not? Because then you're letting us down. You're just taking us for a ride. So I think yes, I do completely accept the points you're making, but I think on the other hand, I think just saying, well, it's just nothing, when they've actually already formally committed to something bigger, I think there's a sort of political tension there that's worth exploring and trying to sort of push.
And that political tension, I think, exists in Starmer reacting to Trussonomics by saying it will be difficult, we will have to balance the books. And then it's up to not just saying, oh, well, that means he's not going to do it, but rather it means that it's now time to look at, the fact that the Tories, with an unassailable majority, tried to do things to, again, their project of reforming British capitalism that they couldn't do. And they couldn't do that because of, not just because of people embarrassing them on television, but because of mass campaigns to threaten to not pay energy bills and so on and so on. And that to suggest that relying on Starmer to just get in and make it kind of bearable isn't going to work, because he will run up against the exact same constraints unless, in my opinion, he is essentially compelled in much the same way as the Tories were compelled by popular pressure, and not just mass dissatisfaction, but actual organizing that actually did happen, right?
Plus the woke bond traders.
Yeah, plus the woke bond traders,
that's
right? But and if that doesn't happen, then I think the current Labour leadership is more likely to default to something less ambitious. But they can be forced to do what is actually necessary.
Yeah, I think that's exactly. I think that the idea that anyone can say, okay, Keir Starmer's number 10, right, great, relax, that's it. I mean, I think no one is really saying that.
We're in a responsible pair of hands. We're in a correct pair of hands. We're in a managerial pair of hands.
Exactly. I mean, exactly. The hands, have it. But yeah, so I think it's absolutely right that sort of campaigns like enough is enough, don't pay, climate movements, the whole sort of tapestry movement and sort of social power that's trying to sort of coalesce to say, like, we've had enough and we can leverage ourselves into a better future out of this crisis, obviously should not dissipate. It should be like remobilize and extend and say, like, try and put, sort of in any future sort of Labour government. And energy is a source of that, because I mean energy, like, I think energy is like, it is the fundamental basis. Like, metabolism is the basis. How we organize flows of energy is like the fundamental political question in a way. And I think you can kind of build a big political campaign about it, because it's not just about like how you turn your lights on. It's about the fact workers are going, are sort of tired at the end of the day. It's because, the regulated metabolism of capitalism is like, bearing down on working class people and making their lives really tough. Why are children going hungry when they go to school? Why, like, almost over 50% of people on universal credit in the last month skipping meals? This is a question of like metabolism, about like how we distribute energy in our economy. As you can unite a sort of wide sort of political campaign to say, like, there really should be a basic energy standard, whether that's literally electricity in your home or the basic calorific intake we all need to live decent, thriving lives. And you mobilize that on all fronts, and you put as much pressure as you can with argumentation, demonstrations in the street, organized labor, think tanks trying to provide solutions, etc., etc. So, like, I don't think anyone should be thinking at all like, oh well, it'll be all right on the night if in 2 years' time.
Or indeed the opposite, that it won't be all right because these people are unpersuadable. The bureaucracy,
exactly.
The bureaucracy and the leadership will be against you, but it doesn't mean that means that they'll win. It means they won once. But what you're seeing is a lot of bureaucracy and a lot of leadership that's in a much more powerful position in terms of the government being beaten, again, not exclusively by woke bond traders, but by actual movements from actual here.
And like some of this sort of like Starmerist sort of like knifing leftwards, that comes from a position of perceived vulnerability as much as strength, I think. It's like this fact that you may be in number 10 in a sort of like uncontrollable situation almost, where you are very vulnerable and you may be sort of at the whims of 18 trillion new Labour MPs who you've barely had time to like vet or select or any of this. I think offers a tremendous possibility. Maybe.
Yeah, we could have Keir Starmer in a caftan going, we need to realign the nation's chakras.
Because ultimately, right, what we are seeing now is the old basically having sort of died.
You're saying that, in the new world, it's not struggling to be born yet. It's, the parents have called the hospital. They've been told there's going to be a 16-hour wait, and they're thinking about getting a taxi.
But but like this is the sort of moment of opportunity is that the old world, it's not just dying. It is now dead.
Sure.
It has died now. And,
There's a doctor there like rubbing its eyebrow and checking its pupil dilation.
And the strategy of keeping it twitching by sending electricity through it has, in one sort of semi-brawl in the House of Commons, also sort of died. And this is why I talked about, this is why I kept going back to the idea of essentially even a future Starmer government being forced to do things, of being forced to do certain things, because because we've seen Tory governments with unassailable majorities being unable to pass anything and largely reacting to events around them, which by all forms of common sense shouldn't be possible. That shouldn't be happening. And so that's why I say it stands to reason that a Labour government with a similarly unassailable majority, but also, let's say, a kind of unwillingness to do what is necessary, or a sort of ideological predisposition not to, or whatever, can also be forced by events. I think the question is, are you going to organize to be one of the events?
Am I tough enough? Hell yes, I'm tough enough.
Yeah, I think this is why I've kind of been taking the view that, like, instead of giving up on electoral politics, it's like, it's a tool in the toolbox, right? And you should, as much as possible, just kind of keep your powder dry, because there would be a moment like this. And this is now the moment, right? This is a moment of immense vulnerability for the Labour right, and one which we can capitalize on, perhaps.
Absolutely.
Inshallah.
So, again, I didn't know that this was going to be an optimistic ending.
Inshallah, and wins an 85%
we can pressure Keir Starmer to become Muslim.
That's right.
Yeah. All we have to do is say that, there's a new thing that you can say that, both Welsh coal miners and also academics, not in London, Oxford, or Cambridge, academics, but in like other cities, They both love saying it.
That's true.
Yeah.
That's true.
And
it's a very sort of like app-enabled religion now. Amazing things are happening in Saudi Arabia. The line is happening.
They started building it.
Yes, yeah.
They're really going for making it look as like, how long are they going to keep that up?
The way of the
It's a
future.
very long city. It could be the length of it. It's unmanageable.
So, but that's Neom talk. That's for a future episode.
Yeah, Tom Walker isn't here. We can't, in all good conscience, talk about Neon without him.
We're not quarate on that basis.
No, that's
So,
correct. Yeah.
I just want to say, I think that's a nice and somewhat uncharacteristically optimistic place to end it. I want to say, Matt, do you have any final thoughts before we go on our merry way?
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't. I think the
I'd like to row back on the
yeah,
optimism.
I think the optimism is exactly because I think we are facing an incredibly, painful, traumatic winter that will not ease particularly, and like moderate solutions to deep systemic crisis will be inadequate. And so the optimism is to say, like, really, I think just cleaving to like actually the solutions, the tools of public investment, democratic ownership, sort of social planning of the economy, sort of, rebalancing power at work, expanding the realm of decommodification so people can live freely and well. These really are the only like durable ways out of the crisis. And so I think, the pessimism is the situation. The optimism is to say, well, we've got to just keep organizing and keep pushing strategically on those things, because actually, really in the current context, these demands are not particularly, radical at all. They're fairly moderate to demand that we can all just live thriving lives.
And with that, I want to say thank you very much for physically coming to the studio and talking to us today.
Yeah, pleasure to be in the bunker.
Absolutely. You know what? We don't even, now that Liz Truss is no longer
We can
PM,
emerge.
we no
Yes,
longer
yeah.
actually need the bunker.
Yeah.
The atomic clock is now 1 minute further from midnight.
That's right, yeah.
And I want to thank all of you out there for being our listeners. And for listening to the free episodes, there's a Patreon. It's $5 a month. You can listen to more of this. The pound, now that Liz Truss is gone, is worth more. So get it while it's on sale.
That's right.
I don't think we have Brisbane tickets left.
I don't think so. No, I don't believe so. But we do have tickets in Canberra. Hey, do you live in Brisbane and fancy a trip? You could come and see us in Canberra.
Yeah, marketing.
So-
The political capital of Australia. There are also still tickets in Sydney because the venue is huge. And Melbourne, there are still some tickets for Britanology. On the 19th.
Melbourne, if you wanted to go to normal TF in Melbourne, you are weeks late, pal. You really fucked it.
Yeah.
If you wanted to go to normal TF in Brisbane, you should have acted ever so slightly
also,
sooner.
very excitingly, our special edition TF Tour T-shirts, which will be on sale at all the dates, are being printed.
That's it. They're actually in
Currently.
Australia. If you want to find a TF Tour T-shirt now,
Intercept the shipment.
yeah, you can do like a kind of.
Please don't do that. It's been a real ball ache organising the shipment.
No, what you need to do, right, is you need to steal an ambulance and a couple of trucks.
Yeah, you
And then,
need a guy with long
Like the
hair.
Joker.
Yeah, no, then
Yeah.
you need a guy with long hair. You need a guy
I'm
with a
gonna
goatee.
miss the Wayne Grow jokes. Right? I'm gonna miss them. I thought I would have more time to elaborate on this bit, but no. Liz
No.
Truss has failed me.
No, I'm afraid not. She went in-
out like Dennis Haysbert.
And so that's the Australia update. Thank you for coming to our live show this last week, and we will see you soon, but not before you check out Commonwealth. Are you a policymaker? Do you need ideas? Well, Commonwealth has some ideas that are
I
lying
was like,
around.
that sounds quite good. Where's this? I need to find some ideas. No, exactly. Yeah, you should. common-wealth.co.uk.
Yeah, that's
They
right.
run a great games too. I've always been a fan.
So
Also, this is coming out on Monday, isn't it?
it's coming out on
Monday night.
on Tuesday, the usual day it comes out.
Does
the
it,
free episode.
Does it not come out at like Monday midnight though?
I consider that Tuesday. Let's go on.
Okay, yeah, fine. Whatever. It is Tuesday currently. In the evening of Tuesday, the 25th, I will be doing a show in Cambridge. Stand up. Do you live in Cambridge? Come to the ADC Theatre at 11 p.m. You can't be busy at 11 p.m. Who is?
I don't know,
You,
cool people.
clearly.
Yeah, me. That's I'm the only guy.
Yeah.
I'm like the dark matter of society.
Yeah.
I'm the inverse of all that is holy.
He thinks crime is funny. Anyway,
That's
bye
right.
everybody.
Bye.
Bye.